It began with a smile. Not the kind of smile you exchange with a stranger in passing, but one that lingered, that held a promise of something more. His name was Jonathan Hayes, and he was my boss. At 42, he was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying, tall, with sharp features, and a voice that could silence a room. I was 32, a junior marketing manager at Hayes & Company, a thriving advertising firm in Chicago. My name is Rachel Carter, and for the past 7 years, I'd been married to Michael, a kind, steady man who loved me in his own quiet way. But Jonathan? He was anything but quiet. The first time I noticed the shift was during a late-night meeting. The office was empty, save for the two of us, and the hum of the city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was the only sound. We were reviewing a campaign for a major client, and I could feel his eyes on me as I presented my ideas. It wasn't the first time he'd looked at me, but this time, it felt different. His gaze was intense, almost searching, and it made my stomach flutter in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Rachel," he said, his voice low and smooth, "you have a way of seeing things others don't. It's refreshing." I smiled, trying to ignore the heat creeping up my neck. "Thank you, Jonathan. That means a lot coming from you." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving mine. "You're too modest. You're one of the most talented people on this team. I've been watching you." The way he said it, so deliberate, so loaded, made my breath catch. I told myself it was nothing, just professional admiration. But deep down, I knew better. There was something in the way he looked at me, in the way his words seemed to carry a double meaning, that I couldn't ignore. Over the next few weeks, the tension between us grew. It was in the way he'd brush past me in the hallway, his hand lingering on my arm for a fraction too long. It was in the way he'd call me into his office under the guise of discussing work, only to steer the conversation toward more personal topics. And it was in the way he'd look at me during meetings, his gaze heavy and knowing, like he could see right through me. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I was married, after all. Michael and I had built a life together, a comfortable, predictable life. He was a good man, a reliable man, but somewhere along the way, the spark between us had faded. We were more like roommates than lovers, and though I loved him, I couldn't help but feel like something was missing. Jonathan, on the other hand, made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. He was magnetic, confident, and he had a way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room. It was intoxicating, and though I knew it was wrong, I couldn't seem to stay away. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, I found myself alone in the office with Jonathan. The rest of the team had left hours ago, and the building was eerily quiet. I was sitting at my desk, staring at my computer screen, when I felt his presence behind me. "Still here?" he asked, his voice soft but commanding. I turned to face him, my heart racing. "Just finishing up some reports." He nodded, his eyes scanning my face. "You work too hard, Rachel. You should take a break." I laughed nervously. Says the man who's always the last to leave. He smiled, but it wasn't his usual charming grin. This smile was different, softer, more intimate. Maybe I just like the company. The air between us felt charged, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. I should have said something, should have deflected or changed the subject, but I couldn't. Instead, I just sat there, my breath shallow, my mind racing. Jonathan stepped closer, his hand resting on the back of my chair. "You're different, Rachel. You know that, right?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Different how?" He leaned down, his face inches from mine. "You're not like the others. You're special." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt a rush of warmth that had nothing to do with the office's heating system. I knew I should pull away, should put an end to whatever this was before it went too far. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest. And then he kissed me. It wasn't a passionate, all-consuming kiss. It was soft, tentative, like he was testing the waters. But it was enough to shatter the fragile illusion of control I'd been clinging to. I kissed him back, my hands trembling as they found their way to his shoulders. For a moment, the world disappeared, and it was just us, two people who had no business being together but couldn't seem to stay apart. The days after the kiss passed in a blur of uncertainty and longing. Every time I saw Jonathan, my heart raced in anticipation, but also in fear. We didn't speak about what had happened, but it hung between us, a secret we both knew too well. There were moments when our eyes would meet across the room, and I could feel the weight of the unspoken words, the electric charge in the air. It wasn't just in the office. I would find myself stealing glances at him when I was alone, replaying his words in my head, wondering if he felt the same confusion, the same pull. I wanted him, there was no denying that, but there was a deep ache in my chest when I thought about the consequences of crossing that line again. One afternoon, after a long meeting, Jonathan suggested we grab lunch together. It wasn't unusual for us to work through lunch, especially with an important campaign on the line. But as we sat in a quiet cafe, the conversation drifted from work to something more personal, more dangerous. "You look different today," he said, his voice low, as if he was carefully choosing his words. "Lighter." I tried to laugh it off, but there was a tremor in my voice. "Maybe I'm just tired." He didn't buy it, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he smiled, that same smile that always made my heart flutter. "Maybe you're just too hard on yourself." I looked down at my hands, suddenly aware of the way my pulse had quickened. "Maybe." The words lingered between us, and I knew what was coming. It wasn't the first time we'd exchanged these looks, these brief moments of silence that carried so much weight. But this time, something felt different. He reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was fleeting, but it was enough to make my breath catch. When we left the cafe, Jonathan suggested we take a walk. It was a warm day, the sun filtering through the trees, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. We walked side by side, not saying much, but the air was thick with something unspoken. The closer we got to the hotel, the more I could feel the tension building, like an invisible thread pulling us towards something neither of us could escape. We reached the hotel lobby, and as we stepped inside, Jonathan turned to me, his expression serious now. "Rachel," he said, his voice soft but filled with intent, "you're not the only one who's been thinking about what happened." I didn't know how to respond. My mind was racing, my thoughts jumbled. The logical part of me wanted to pull away, to stop this before it went too far. But the rest of me, the part that had been dormant for so long, wanted nothing more than to be with him, to explore the connection we had. Without thinking, I followed him into the elevator. The ride to the top floor felt like an eternity. We didn't speak, but the silence was charged, every inch of space between us heavy with anticipation. When the elevator doors opened, Jonathan didn't waste any time. He took my hand and led me into a quiet room. As the door closed behind us, I felt a wave of warmth wash over me. The air was thick with the scent of fresh linens and something else, something unfamiliar and intoxicating. Jonathan turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "I don't want to regret this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I only nodded, my body moving closer to his. It was as if the pull between us had finally become too strong to resist. He kissed me then, not with the hesitation of our first encounter, but with the weight of everything we hadn't said. His lips were firm, demanding, and I found myself responding without thought, without hesitation. His hands were on my back, pulling me closer, and I could feel the heat radiating from him. Every touch, every movement, felt like a promise. But even as we gave in to the moment, the guilt clawed at the edges of my mind. This wasn't just about me. It was about Michael, about the life I had built with him, and yet, in that moment, none of that mattered. It was just Jonathan and me, caught in a moment of reckless desire. Later, as we lay together, the weight of our actions settled over me. There was no escaping it now. The affair had begun, and there was no telling where it would lead. But the truth was, I didn't know if I could stop it. We saw each other more often after that, our encounters increasingly frequent. We'd meet during lunch breaks, or in the quiet moments when the office was empty. Sometimes it was just a touch, a shared glance. Other times, we found ourselves alone in anonymous hotel rooms, stealing moments of passion that never felt quite real, yet always left us wanting more. It wasn't just physical. There was something deeper between us, something unspoken that lingered long after we parted ways. But with every stolen kiss, every brief embrace, the weight of my marriage pressed harder on me. I couldn't help but wonder how long I could keep up the charade, how long I could live with the lie. But for now, all that mattered was the next moment, the next meeting, the next stolen hour with Jonathan. And in those moments, I could pretend that nothing else mattered, that there were no consequences, no choices to be made. The affair continued for months, a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered promises. Jonathan and I were careful, or so we thought. We met in secret, in dimly lit bars and anonymous hotel rooms, always careful to cover our tracks. But no matter how hard we tried, the guilt never went away. It was always there, lurking in the shadows, a constant reminder of what I was doing. Michael, meanwhile, remained oblivious. He was as kind and steady as ever, and though I tried to convince myself that he didn't deserve this, I couldn't bring myself to end it. Jonathan had become my escape, my refuge from the monotony of my marriage, and I wasn't ready to let that go. But then, one night, everything changed. I was at home, sitting on the couch with Michael, when he turned to me and said, "Rachel, is everything okay? You've been distant lately." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. You just seem different. Like you're not really here." I wanted to tell him the truth, to come clean about everything. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded and said, "I'm fine, Michael. Just tired." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push it. And for that, I was grateful. The affair came to an abrupt end one rainy afternoon. Jonathan and I were in his office, going over a presentation, when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "I have to take this," he said, stepping out of the room. I waited, my stomach churning with unease. When he returned, his face was pale, his jaw tight. "Rachel," he said, his voice strained. "We need to talk." My heart sank. "What's wrong?" He hesitated, then said, "My wife knows." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What? How?" "I don't know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "But she found out. And she's not happy." I felt a wave of panic wash over me. "What are we going to do?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. "I don't know, Rachel. But this has to end." I wanted to argue, to beg him not to leave me. But deep down, I knew he was right. The affair had been a mistake, a reckless indulgence that had spiraled out of control. And now, we were both paying the price. The fallout was brutal. Jonathan's wife filed for divorce, and the scandal rocked the office. I managed to keep my involvement a secret, but the guilt weighed heavily on me. Michael, meanwhile, remained oblivious, though I could see the hurt in his eyes every time I pulled away from him. I tried to move on, to rebuild my life, but it wasn't easy. Jonathan and I avoided each other at work, and though I told myself it was for the best, I couldn't help but miss him. He had been my escape, my refuge, and without him, I felt lost. But as the weeks turned into months, I began to realize that the affair had been a symptom of a deeper problem, one that had nothing to do with Jonathan and everything to do with me. I had been unhappy in my marriage, yes, but instead of confronting that unhappiness, I had run from it. And in doing so, I had hurt everyone I cared about. One night, as I lay in bed next to Michael, I made a decision. I would come clean, not just about the affair, but about everything. It wouldn't be easy, and it might cost me my marriage, but it was the only way to move forward. "Michael," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to talk." He turned to me, his eyes filled with concern. "What is it, Rachel?" I took a deep breath, then said the words I'd been dreading. "I've been unfaithful." The room fell silent, and for a moment, I thought he hadn't heard me. But then his face crumpled, and I knew he had. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why would you do this?" I didn't have an answer, at least not one that would make it better. All I could do was tell him the truth, that I had been selfish, that I had made a mistake, and that I was sorry. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Michael moved out, and though he said he needed time to think, I knew our marriage was over. I had destroyed the life we'd built together, and there was no going back. But as I sat alone in our empty house, I realized something. The affair had been a wake-up call, a painful but necessary reminder that I couldn't keep running from my problems. I had to face them, no matter how hard it was. And so, I began the long, difficult process of rebuilding my life. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I wanted to give up. But slowly, I began to find my way back to myself. The affair with Jonathan had been a mistake, but it had also been a lesson. And though I would always carry the guilt of what I'd done, I knew that I had to forgive myself if I ever wanted to move forward.